I'm Alan, and this video is about scaffolding SaaS projects using Node Package Manager and the Sass.js framework. So those of you with a bit of SaaS experience will know that there are many ways to structure a SaaS project and just as many ways to deploy it. With all this flexibility, there is a cost, and that cost is complexity. So how can you conquer a complex codebase when it is scattered across a maze of metadata, microservices, or remote directories, built by multiple users with different coding styles and deployment techniques? And how might you instead scaffold your SaaS project so it fits neatly into a Git structure, self-documents, and can be quickly understood by new hire developers? In this session, we explore the Sass.js framework, an open source and opinionated framework, providing the power and control of local SaaS development, whilst retaining the governance and scalability of remote project execution. It can be applied to jobs on Fire, stored processes on Sass9, and for the hardcore-based programmers, even regular .sass files and catalog entries. So what is the Sass.js framework? It's a collection of parts, each of which can be used individually, but when you put them together, they provide a real accelerator for data science projects and SaaS apps. So the first part then is a macro library, Sass.js core, with well over 100 macros for macro functions, macro procedures, metadata macros, and via macros. There's the Sass.js adapter written in TypeScript, uses Axios to connect the front end and the back end. And finally, there's the Sass.js CLI command line interface that provides all kinds of commands that you can use to compile, build, deploy, execute, set up flows, create folders, CI/CD for your SaaS target. There are some prerequisites to using this framework. The hard one is Node.js. So Node.js is the runtime for the CLI. We also recommend VS Code. It's a really good editor. And Git Bash, if you're on Windows, will give you the connection to Git and also Unix-style commands. You can use PowerShell, but we recommend Git Bash. To install the Sass.js CLI, you can do that in one command using npm I for install -g for global @sassjs/CLI. And with that, let's move to a demo. So I'm opening VS Code, and in a terminal window, I'm going to run the Sass.js create command to create a project called My Project with a template of jobs. And that will take a predefined template with some jobs and macros and things and put them into a local project here. So if I expand that, once it downloads, here we go. There's quite a few files, so I'm just going to go through some of them. There's a package JSON that's used by Node Package Manager, and usually the main thing it does is define the dependencies. So here there's just one dependency, which is the macro core library. It's fixed to version 2.9.3, and I can see that here in the Node modules folder. There's also some scripts defined here, and these aliases are shortcuts for the equivalent Sass.js commands, so I don't have to type them out. So npm run exec, for instance, will run the Sass.js job execute. We'll come back to that. There's also a git ignore, and the folders in here are ignored by Git. So node modules, the third-party dependencies, we don't need to push those to Git. A Sass.js build folder, that's a temporary folder full of the Sass.js temporary build files, and then the .env files contain the client and secret and token, and we don't want to push access tokens to source control, so they're ignored. There's some other folders in here, so there's a DB folder with some DDL and Sass data lines. There's a macros folder with Sass macros in it, and a programs folder with Sass programs. And maybe you're wondering the difference between a macros and a programs folders. So macros contain only macro definitions with a macro and a mend, whereas programs can contain really just any arbitrary code. And what you may also have noticed is these headers. So I'll also go down to a job, and you can see these have also got the same headers. So every Sass program in a Sass.js project doesn't have to have, but it should have a header styled like this. And this isn't a Sass.js standard, it's a Doxygen standard. Doxygen is a third-party tool that we use for auto-generating the documentation. And yeah, Doxygen stands for like documentation generation, I think originally. Anyway, so @file tells Doxygen that it's a file. @brief is a short one-line description of the file. And then @details is a longer description of the file. And within this description, you can use Markdown, which is a text-based way to represent things like 2 hashes is a heading 2, bold header, and then @li is a bullet point. And this section here, we start to see something that you can embed HTML in a detail section. But these HTML tags are specific also to Sass.js. So here you can see where the Sass macros are defined. And what the CLI does is read this header, and where it sees a space-based heading for Sass macros line, then Sass.js knows that beneath that will be a list of macros that need to be compiled into this job. It's the same with programs. However, whereas a macro can be just easily inserted at the beginning of a job, a Sass program contains free-form code, and you can't just stick it in anywhere. So what the CLI does when we run compile is it will wrap this file up in input statements and write them to a file ref of your choosing that you specify there, and I'll come on to demonstrate that. There are also data inputs and data outputs, and these tags are used to these drive the data lineage in the Sass.js documentation, which again we'll come on to. So these are the jobs split across 2 folders, and there's also a job init and a job term. So these go at the beginning and the end of a job. So maybe you're wondering how Sass.js knows where all of these jobs are, where the macros are, what's a macro and what's a program. So that's a good question. Now, in every Sass.js project, there is a Sass.js folder containing a Sass.js config file, and this is the place that essentially describes the whole project. So if you go and work on any Sass.js project anywhere, you just need to look at this one config file, and you know exactly where the macros are stored, where the programs are stored, where the jobs are stored, where the init and the term program is, any macro variables that are inserted into each of the jobs. And there's also a description of the target. Now, the target is the place that you will deploy your jobs and services. And a target could be, say, dev, test, and production, or it could be one target could be Sass9, one could be Via. And this really describes where you're deploying it to. And you can also make overrides. So you could have some macros that are specific to Via and some that are specific to 9 by placing them here. So you can see we've got a name, that's the alias, a server type, which is Sass9 or Sass Via, and an app lock. So this would be the root folder in Sass Drive or in Sass metadata, underneath which the project gets deployed. There's still some things missing here, so we don't know the server URL and some other bits. Now to get that, we need to run a command called, so I'll just change it into the project and run Sass.js add cred for credentials for the Via target. And then I will get a series of prompts. First one being the URL where my Sass server is. And the next one, the client ID. So I've picked this up from my .env file. You may need to ask your administrator for yours. A client secret. And then I get a URL which I must visit to pick up my authorization code. So I'll just authenticate, grab my authorization code, head on back and paste it in here. So I've now got a .env file which contains my access token and my refresh token, and that will mean that I can deploy easily to Via without usernames or passwords. So now I've added a target. So if I look inside my Sass.js config, I can see that I've got more information here, more things I can configure. Okay, so the next step then, compile. So just to refresh, if we go back to a job. So here's an example of a program, some program, and this is an interesting one because I've got this really long line. How am I going to compile that into a job? So I'm going to open a job, make data 3, and I'm going to add it as an input. So heading for Sass programs, and then I'll put the name of the program, and I'll give it a file ref, and a file ref has to be 8 characters. It's Sass rules for a file ref, so I'll call that fref5. Now if I want to include that program anywhere in my job, all I have to do is type %include fref5, and that will include my arbitrary code. Just to demonstrate that, I'm going to run a Sass.js compile, and this is the part, do it for the via target, that will read all of the jobs and services if I had any web services, and compile all the dependencies, the macros in the programs, and the dependencies of the dependencies, and add them all to a folder, the temporary folder Sass.js build. So then if I find my make data 3, here's the macro precode, here's my really long line, and you can see if I scroll right, there's a trailing at pointer symbol, so that really long line will still get written out as a really long line, but it's sent here on multiple lines. If I scroll further down, I've got my job init program, and then finally I've got my job with my %include, and then at the end my job term. So that's great. I've got a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 jobs. How am I going to get these into Via? So the next step then is a Sass.js build. And what that does is take those 5 programs, but it could be 50 or 500, and compile them all, well, concatenate them all into a single build file called the name of the target.json. And this is a JSON file that contains all the jobs. Now, because I've got a client and a secret and an access token, I can deploy these. But if I didn't have that, or if I'm on Sass 9, there's a plan B, which is a .sass program that gets generated. And you can also copy paste this big long Sass program into Sass Studio or Enterprise Guide, and that would also create all the jobs. In Sass 9, it would create them as stored processes. But let's flip back to the via JSON and deploy that. So to deploy this to my app lock from my target, all I have to write is Sass.js deploy to my via target, and that will read in that JSON file and create all of those jobs in that folder. You can see here deploying service pack to Sass server at my app lock location. So that's done, that's deployed. So next step then might be to actually run some of these jobs. So I'm just going to get a refresh on the command. So here it is, Sass.js job execute, but I don't have to type that out because I can use the npm run exec alias, and that's just going to execute this Sass.js job execute, and then the relative path to the job from the app lock. It could be a full path, but I've got a relative. And then the log goes here, and then I'm using the via target. So you can see that's been sent, it's polling the status, it's fetched the log. Here's the log. So that's great, I've run one job. But what if I've got 500 of these jobs and they're all related to each other? We also have a flow command, and the flow command uses this flow.json format. So the JSON defines waves, individual waves, so each wave triggers all these jobs at once, and then each wave can have predecessors. So then you can define, as long as it finishes successfully, then the next wave will start. And the syntax for running that is, again, in the package JSON file, but I'm not going to write it out. I'm just going to run npm run flow, which here you can see is an alias for Sass.js flow execute, and then S for source, which is the source JSON with the flow definition. the logs will all go to this folder, and it will also create a CSV file which will show the status of each job and the results. So you can see now that that's polling and it's running the jobs. I'm even getting the PIDs, so I can see on which thread it's running. And if I open that CSV, I've got statistics, the status, etc., etc. Great. So I've compiled, built, and deployed my project. I've executed a job. I've executed a flow. Maybe next I want to document my project. So before I document it, I'm going to add a .config. The reason for that is I want to add some extra configuration. So display macro core, I am using the core macros in this project, so I'll keep that as true. If I wanted to send my HTML documentation somewhere else, I could put a location here, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to stick it in the SAS.js build folder, which is the default. And then because I have data controller, I can add the location of the data controller server. So it's SAS. And that will enable me to open the tables from the data lineage straight into data controller, which I'll show shortly. So that's all configured. So now I just need to run SAS.js doc. You also need to have Doxygen installed for this to work. There's a warning because I didn't specify my target, so it defaulted to the first target, which was Via. And that is now generating all of the documents in the docs folder in SAS.js build. So if I open this in a folder, so yeah, here's the documentation. That was for a file. So if I open a job, here's the document. I've got my details here, the SAS macros. I can click through and see the underlying macros. I've got a file list with everything in. I've even got a home page that's taken from the README. And I've got a lineage diagram taken from those data inputs and data outputs. If I click on the job, I go straight to the job definition. And then also if I click on a table, then this opens Data Controller. So Data Controller is our product, which is free for 5 users. Get in touch if you're interested. That lets you modify tables safely. So like you make a change, that change goes to a staging area, and then it gets approved. So just to give a brief overview of this tool, because it is interesting, because it was actually built with SAS.js. You can do a few things in the viewer. For instance, you've got full table search. You've got table refresh. You can view lineage. So if you're on SAS 9, this is the SAS 9 version. You can view the lineage for, say, a particular table. Same as you get impact analysis, or for a particular column from source to target or target to source. Download this in PNG, SVG. There's an editor, so you could pick a table, you could click edit, and you can add a row. We've got front-end data validations. So for instance, these are automatically uppercased. The minimum approval is 1. I can mark a row as deleted. I can make a change to a value. And this is all very safe. I can hit submit because there's a separation between the role of the editor, who makes an edit with a reason and submits that, and the role of an approver. So I have both hats, so I'm going to go to the approval screen, and as my approver, I can look at the differences between the new and the old, the new and the changed records, and I can accept or reject those. There's also an audit trail, so you can see what's been approved and who approved what. So yeah, this is all running using SAS.js, mainly the adapter. There's a debug mode, so if I make a request to SAS, I can see all the history of those requests. So that's it for the scaffolding SaaS apps demonstration. If you'd like to know more, do get in touch. All of the code is on GitHub. If you have problems, you can raise an issue there. In terms of the roadmap, the next big thing we'll be building is a VS Code plugin, so you can compile and run your SaaS code straight from VS Code. Have a great forum.